Welcome to Unlocking Bach, audio program notes to accompany all 132 concerts in The Complete Bach. This is Dr. Chris Shepard, Artistic Director. Now, let's talk Bach. Hello everyone, this is Chris Shepard, the Artistic Director of The Complete Bach and the conductor of the Worcester Chorus. Now, there's been some requests this year that I occasionally do a video instead of an audio Unlocking Bach or a Bach 101. You will see why I don't do this often. I am, as all of my choristers know, the world's worst multitasker. So what you are going to get to see is me flipping through different pages trying to find everything. Just bear with me so that I can see you, you can see me one last time this year. Now, although this is part of The Complete Bach, the irony is that there is no Bach on this program that we are doing on May 18th. It features the Charpentier Te Deum and Handel Dixit Dominus. Now, the name Charpentier certainly suggests straight away that it is French, and that is absolutely true. He did not work in the court of Louis XIV, but he was in that orbit, and he wrote music that was very much along the lines of people like Jean-Baptiste Lully, who was the court composer. Now, Handel was actually Bach's exact contemporary. He was born in 1685, not that many miles from where Bach was born. But here's the interesting thing about Handel. He was extremely well-traveled, as opposed to Bach, who really did not go much further than that North German area into which he was born. In his early 20s, like many composers in Europe, Handel made the pilgrimage to Italy. This would be very important for his career because although we tend to think of Handel as the composer of oratorios, it was actually in his lifetime the composition of Italian opera for which he was most famous. So he went to learn more about Italian music, and you might imagine from this composition, his Dixit Dominus, written when he was about 22 or 23, that he might have just settled in Rome and worked there for a long time. His biography went in other directions. He, of course, ended up in London, which was where we know most of his music from. But this early piece of his, this Dixit Dominus, is more Italian than the Italians, shall we say, because what he was trying to prove was that he could write in that idiom. So when I wanted to do a Bach-adjacent concert for all of you that would show these two forms, French music from the court of Louis XIV and Italian music from sunny Rome, from sunny Venice in particular, you think of Vivaldi, I thought of these two pieces. He would approve because he knew the music of Handel. I can't quite remember right now if he knew the music of Charpentier, but he certainly knew the music of Lully. And as I've said in so many of my Bach 101 and Unlocking Bach programs this year, the specific genius of Johann Sebastian Bach, despite that extraordinarily German name, was his ability to synthesize those three strains of music in Germany in the Baroque period. French music, court of Louis XIV, Italian music, that wonderful, very virtuosic violin style, and the cantabile singing style, with the more austere, very Lutheran, very contrapuntal, things like fugues, music from his own area. And that is the real genius of Bach. Now, I should also say, because you know enough about all this music now, that I don't want to pretend that French music was solely French, or Italian music was solely Italian, or North German music was solely North German. That's not true. There was a lot of crossover for everybody in this period. But to my mind, nobody totally synthesizes it quite as much as Johann Sebastian Bach. So in this final Unlocking Bach, it's not really Unlocking Bach, is it? It's unlocking Handel and unlocking Charpentier, but it's Unlocking Bach in a much larger sense. French music, the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, l'état c'est moi, the state it is I, everything publicly centered around him, even in the church in a sense, so that you get this Te Deum, which is just an old Catholic prayer. he actually mandated that the Te Deum would be sung anytime there was a big victory. For example, we think that this piece by Marc-Antoine Charpentier was written for the Peace of Steinkirk in 1692, when Bach wasn't even a decade old yet. So many of these treaties, because there were so many wars and skirmishes in this era. Listen to the beginning of this. You may have heard this before. I think that different PBS programs have used it. It is all trumpet and timpani and fanfare. Very, very French, very Louis XIV. So you get that. This is what the French music that inspires Bach would be like. It is harmonically very simple, partly because as soon as you have trumpets and timpani, they can't go through a lot of different keys. So they tended to keep it fairly simple, and you get that sense of grandeur with it. That is an overture or a prelude, but let's think of it. We call that form the French overture, and Bach uses those. I'm going to show you what he did in a piece that you heard earlier this year, in fact. But the other aspect of French music, so that there is the overture, which would be played as the king entered the space, whether it was a religious space or an opera or a ballet. It is actually the ballet that is so important for French music of this period. Many of you came and heard Jeremy Dank play those extraordinary partitas, or Zlatibor Fohm earlier in the year, who played those incredible cello suites, two really just unforgettable concerts. I've spoken a great deal to you in Bach 101 podcasts about the fact that the suite form, the French suite, the allemande, the courante, the sarabande, the gigue, that those dance forms were very French, were very Louis XIV, and originated, for the most part, in ballets. So I just want to show you an example of this guy, Jean-Baptiste Lully, who was the court composer to Louis XIV. And I want to show you what happens when he goes from the overture into a ballet dance type. So it begins very regal. Now we say regal, but it's regal because we associate this music with it. What did I say so far? Is that the harmonies are very simple. It's very chordal. You've got trumpet and timpani. But the other thing is what we call dotted rhythms. Pa-pum, pa-pum, pa-pa. Long, short, long, short, long, short, long. And this has come to be, if you were to ask a musician right now to improvise something regal, as if King Charles was going to walk into the room, that's the sort of thing that we would do. That originated in the Baroque period in French music. So you get that overture style, very dotted. No real melody particularly. And then it goes into this next section. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So this is the two pillars of French Baroque music. The overture style, the fanfare, the regal, the trumpets, the timpani, which you will absolutely hear in that Charpentier from the very opening, and the dance-like, bounce, the buoyancy of the ballet music, of those dance forms that we heard in the suite. And you will hear that all the way through the Charpentier Te Deum. Now, let me show you a few more things that happen in the Te Deum. Like a ballet. Now, an opera has its scenes, doesn't it? And it might have an aria, and then a chorus, then a duet, with discrete movements. Ballet isn't like that because the dancers are on stage, so you want each little scene to pour into the next. The vocal music in the French Baroque is like that as well. Bach is not like that. This is a way in which Bach did not follow. He took elements of the French, the di-dum, ba-bum, ba-ba, the fanfare, and he took the ballet, the suite, the dance forms. He took that, but Bach's music, if you think of the cantatas, they tend to be discrete movements. Same thing is true in Handel operas. and in his oratorios, and as we'll see in the Dixit Dominus. But with the Charpentier, you'll see that one follows into the next. And what do I mean by this? That as soon as that big overture finishes, the bass sings this. And forgive me, you're always supposed to forgive me my singing, right? Te Deum laudamus, Te Deum laudamus. But the accompaniment still has elements of that fanfare. And then he finishes that mini aria, we might call it an arioso, and straight away the choir comes in. Listen to how the choir sings. So he finishes, and then the choir enters. They sing the same notes and the same rhythms at the same time. This is called homophonic, same sound. This is very typical of this piece, and to be honest, quite typical of French choral music in general of the period. They did not do what Bach did, which was to use fugues and counterpoint all the time, particularly in the Te Deum, which is so grand. This Te Eternum Patrem omnes, really also just as grand as the fanfare, but in longer notes. You will notice that throughout this Charpentier Te Deum in the concert on the 18th, or if you go and listen to a recording after this, that the choir is used as a block of sound, as a counterpoise to the soloists who are used differently. Now, I also want to show you another kind of contrast. So this, I have shown you the choir type of sound. So they later come in to say the words, "Heaven and earth are full of your glory." And again, it's homophonic, just block chords. But I just want to show you how he alternates. So we have the orchestra, trumpets and timpani, doing another little fanfare. And then the choir enters right here. Pleni succelli et terra. Back to fanfare. And you just get this sense of ongoing grandeur. The choir has one kind of grandeur, the trumpets and timpani have another kind of grandeur. Now remember what I said. There's no such thing as pure forms. There's no such thing as pure French music or pure Italian music. There is counterpoint. There is a little hint of sort of semi-fugue in this near the end. And this is the little theme. I have to be fair to Bach over my shoulder. This theme is so much simpler than a fugue subject he would write, but you know, it's something. It goes like this, and it means, "In you have I trusted, let me never be confounded. In te Domine speravi, non confundar." And in any kind of style where the harmony has to remain simple, then a fugue subject has to be incredibly simple. In te Domine speravi, non confundar. Now I'm going to stop singing. You're welcome. And I'm going to play this little section I'm going to try to bring out that fugue subject. You will see it is way simpler than a Bach fugue, but it hints at the idea of a fugue, which really here is saying that people from everywhere who have been delivered through this treaty, the Steinkirk treaty that has been signed, people everywhere have come together to praise God, and in praising God are praising the Sun King, because that was so inextricably bound in his identity. And this idea of the fugue is the everybody sort of idea. So have a listen. Altos, then tenors, then sopranos. Altos have it again. Basses have it. So you get it. It's a very simple fugue. It's even something like the Sicut Locutus Est that I used as an example in Bach 101, which is a simple, for Bach, is simple. It's not simple. This is much more basic. And how does it arrive at this part of the piece? Again, the fanfare, trumpets, and timpani, and then the choir enters. So this idea of the contrast between soloists, choir, and large orchestra, trumpets, and timpani, that contrast is important all the way through. But it's important in the sense that it's important in a ballet, that the action is through. So this piece is what we call through composed. There are 3 times that Charpentier says this is a break. So you have to break here. But even then, they're not huge breaks. It's not the end of a movement break. I just wanted to show you 2 examples, one by Handel, who you can't see, but that other print up there is one of those Hogarth prints of a choir singing through the oratorio Judith, for example. So we want to include him. What does he sound like when he is channeling French music? I think you've heard this before. Right? So the simple chords, just 1, 4, 5, something like that, and tiam, papam, papa, and it's all trumpets and timpani. This is music for the royal fireworks. And it's a great example of what we talk about with all of these forms and styles melding. It was a German composer using French music to praise the English king who had begun as a German elector. So this is the sense that we like to think of ourselves now as the multinational and the Eurozone and all of that. But in fact, plus ça change. It's always been like this in Europe, that there has been crossover between the different styles. And finally, we always have to go back to Bach, don't we? This is from the very first concert of the Complete Bach this year. This is the opening of Cantata 119 that was sung by Concora. What does this remind you of? It's all there, right? Even for Bach, it's simple harmonies. Charam, papam, papa. It is the dotted rhythms that make the French overture, and even that little sweep up. If you remember that cantata, how could you remember it though after everything that you've heard this year? But if you do remember it, you would remember that Bach used 4 trumpets. Extraordinarily rare. Nothing could be more French than that, than a sea of trumpets praising God. But how did it begin? It began in France, praising the Sun King, who saw himself as God's representative on earth. That's half the program. Charpentier, Te Deum. The other half, as I said, Handel, Dixit Dominus. Very early in his life, in his early 20s, Handel moved to Italy for a time so that he could learn more about the Italian style. As somebody who really saw himself as somebody who would focus on opera later, it was important that he absorbed that style and perhaps even work there, which he did for a time, but he went back to Germany, and it was in Germany that he worked for the person who became George I in England, but that's a whole other story for another time. But what I love about this piece, the Dixit Dominus, is that if you did not know that this was George Frederick Handel, you would absolutely think that it was Antonio Vivaldi. So let's see what aspects of that sort of Italian style we can find in the beginning of the Handel Dixit Dominus. So we've talked about the virtuosic string writing, and we've talked about those chord progressions going in a circle of fifth. Here is the opening of that Dixit Dominus. Sweating, it is because it is so hard to play that kind of music on the piano. This music was so idiomatic for string writing, so that a gesture that might go back and forth with the bow over the strings on the violin becomes something that is much more virtuosic in a way that's not so pleasant for the piano. But it gives you the idea of a few things. One thing is that left hand. This is very typical of Italian Baroque music, that the basso continuo is almost a motor. It just keeps rolling along so that it can provide a lot of energy and buoyancy for what comes above it. Falling fifth progression, did you hear that? It's that chord progression. It's somehow a little hidden with the violin figuration above it, but it's in there. And then this is another thing that I find to be quite standard in Italian Baroque music. I call it the arresting chord because it's harmonically arresting, but it also arrests that constant flow, that motoric sense that is so often in the music. And it's just really dramatic. But it's still wonderful in that sense of providing so much energy and so much buoyancy for the music. So this is Handel being Italian, in the same way that Bach would himself be Italian, but in a much more pure form. Because what you need to understand is that the very young Handel had gone, like so many European composers would do, to Italy to try his hand at writing Italian music. Ultimately, it would become Italian opera. And this was very well received, this Dixit Dominus. And he was able to get some patronage, though he did ultimately return to Germany, only later to go with the prince that he worked for in Germany, who later became King George I of England. So what are some other aspects of this Italian music that we see in Bach? Well, in the last concert of the season, except for the organ concert, one concert before that, the Cantatathon, you heard Kevin Neal conduct his All Saints Choir in BWV 133. This is a terrific example of Bach channeling his Italian energy. Sounds like a violin concerto. The violin part is really important, but you hear that descending sequence with a lot of in the orchestra are all these 16th note patterns. Again, very difficult to show it on the piano because there's just so much activity in there. Very Italian. And we hear in so many examples in Bach's music. I think probably if you had to say percentage-wise what is Bach more than anything, it's probably Italian, because that Italian style is so immediately attractive, but of course always refracted through the prism of his own North German sensibility, which is why we find so many fugues in his music. Another big aspect of Italian Baroque music is the solo writing for singers as well. Don't forget that opera originated in Italy. Listen to this section. This is hard enough to play on piano. It is crazy that this is a solo for a singer in the right hand. Ton of that everywhere. They were very famous in Italy, not just for the violin school of teaching and playing Corelli, Torelli, those composers, but also the Italian opera style. The teachers developed this incredibly florid technique. It's very difficult to sing, but they were able to do that, and then they went all through Europe. And in fact, Jauchzet Gott, this very famous cantata for soprano and trumpet, combining the French, in a sense, French and Italian, by Johann Sebastian Bach. We think it was written for a soprano in Dresden who had come from Italy. So all of these cross currents in Europe, so important during this period. Another aspect of this music that is so important is something that I would call the espressivo, the cantabile style in the music. Can I play for you the beginning of the Stabat Mater by a composer known as Pergolesi? Now, if you saw the movie Amadeus, and who has not seen the movie Amadeus, in the scene early on where we get to see the young Salieri as a boy singing in a church choir, it features the opening of this movement. It is so beautiful and so expressive. I'll play it for you, then show you what the elements are. It's quite simple the way that it's constructed. In the left hand, like I said, the continuo in Italian music is motoric. Continues the whole time, just these short notes, but above it, two parts. Dissonance, consonance. It just goes back and forth between these rubs, then that relaxes, rubs, relaxes. This expressive style is quite common, and these are called suspensions, by the way, when you suspend one note against another and then it resolves. And we find this in Bach's writing quite a lot, and we find it in the most fantastic way in the Dixit Dominus. What Handel does, which I just find terrific, is the unison strings, because the Handel Dixit Dominus features strings only, because that's so Italian, as opposed to the idea of the Charpentier, where the trumpets and timpani are so important for the Sun King, this juxtaposition of the two styles. He has unison strings do this pattern. It's, as I just said, it's like a continuo. It just circles around itself, and you heard some sequences ba-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, that you have within there, that structure. Then you have this duet above it. You have two sopranos. The same idea. It's the suspension, resolution, suspension, resolution. It is, just in terms of the mechanics of the composition, quite easy, just the idea behind it. But boy, when you hear it put together, it is so expressive. And of course, the singing of it is really difficult because he puts the sopranos up in the stratosphere. That's part of what makes it so beautiful. Interestingly, Mozart does the same thing in his Mass in C minor in a glorious duet movement half a century later. So it's very much part of that Italian, what would become operatic vernacular. And it's so powerful. Those suspensions are just heart-wrenching when you hear them in person. Finally, I did say about the Charpentier that because that French tradition was essentially a ballet tradition, and who wants to see a bunch of dancers standing around while they go to the next piece, that the Charpentier Te Deum tends to move very seamlessly from one movement to the next. That is not true of the Handel Dixit Dominus. It's not true of the Italian style. It's particularly not true of the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. You've seen plenty of cantatas to know that each movement is its own discrete piece of music. I've spoken through the year in Bach 101 about the doctrine of affect, which says that each individual piece is meant to exemplify and allow the listener to feel one emotion. And so this idea of having the separate movements is so important for that. So this visual, as opposed to just audio, Unlocking Bach that you have shared with me today is a chance to see these two strands that go into the river of Bach's genius. French music, the Sun King, trumpets and timpani, and then the Italian, the buoyancy, the virtuosic playing and virtuosic singing, and those harmonies, the falling fifth. This is such important part of Bach's compositional style. But of course, he melds it with his own native North German style through the use of counterpoint and fugue and reference to the Lutheran Church and its rich musical history. I can't believe that we are coming to the end of this first year. 1 out of 11 down, about 9% of everything that we are going to do. But I hope that everything you've experienced this year has shown you how worthy a project like this is. That it is like an onion, this music of Bach. Every time you take a layer off, all you see is how many layers remain of the genius of this extraordinary composer. I'm so glad to be on this journey with you. Have a great summer away from me, but I look forward to seeing you again in September. Thanks so much.